My lawn doesn't grow. It submits to a regimen of chemical subjugation and geometric discipline. It was 600 hours. The air was crisp, smelling of wet fescue and the metallic tang of absolute victory. I stood on the patio, surveying Sector 4, the backyard. I was wearing my tactical cargo shorts, the ones with 17 pockets, mostly filled with carabiners I don't know how to use, and holding a thermal mug of black coffee that was hot enough to melt teeth. Today was V-Day, Victory Day. Suspended from the branch of the ancient oak tree was the asset, the Fort Knox 3000. It gleamed in the morning light, a cylindrical monolith of aerospace-grade polycarbonate and powder-coated steel. It cost $450. It featured a weight-activated drop cage, a spinning baffle system based on centrifuge technology, and a warranty that claimed it was impervious to biological interference. "Eat up, you avian patriots," I whispered. "The buffet is open. The borders are closed." I took a sip of coffee. It tasted like battery acid and triumph. I was a god of engineering. I had conquered the food chain. At 6:08, the perimeter alarm tripped. It was just my eyes seeing movement, but in my head, a siren blared. He emerged from the hedgerow, the general. He was a massive eastern gray squirrel, though squirrel felt like an insult to his bulk. He moved with the heavy rolling gait of a dock worker looking for a fight. He had a patch of missing fur on his flank that looked suspiciously like a shiv wound. "Target acquired," I muttered, my pulse remaining a steady icy 60 BPM. "Proceed to the kill zone, you furry idiot. Try the baffle." The general approached the pole. He didn't look at the feeder. He didn't look at the baffles. He looked at the pole the way a structural engineer looks at a load-bearing wall. He jumped. It wasn't a scramble. It was a teleportation. He bypassed the lower baffle, designed by NASA scientists, mind you, by simply extending his body into an impossible, liquid-like tube and shooting straight up the center. He hit the seed tray with a thud that shook the branch. The weight-sensitive cage triggered. It slammed down. I smirked. "Gotcha." The general simply inhaled, compressing his rib cage to the width of a playing card, and shimmied through the bars of the cage. He was inside the fortress. I lowered my coffee. The mug trembled. He sat amidst the premium sunflower hearts, $28 per bag. He grabbed a nut, and then he turned. He looked through the patio glass. He found me. He didn't blink. His eyes were black beads of infinite void. He cracked the shell, and shoved the kernel into his mouth. He chewed slowly, his jaw working in a circular, grinding rhythm. He was maintaining eye contact with a level of intimacy that made me want to call the police. Crunch, crunch, crunch. He wasn't just eating birdseed. He was eating my credit score. He was eating my masculinity. You little biological mistake," I sputtered, the smugness draining out of me like oil from a cracked pan. The vein in my temple began to thump a heavy bass line. The general reached for another nut, never breaking the stare. He twitched his tail once, a middle finger in squirrel semaphore. "Oh, it's like that?" I hissed, slamming my coffee down on the wicker table, splashing hot liquid onto my shin. I didn't feel the burn. I only felt the hate. Phase 1 failed, initiating scorched earth protocols. I retreated to the garage, my forward operating base. The enemy had agility. Fine, I would counter with physics, specifically the reduction of the coefficient of friction to absolute zero. I rummaged through my shelves of hazardous materials until I found it. A 5-gallon tub of black Mamba high-viscosity axle grease. The label featured a skull wearing a hard hat. It was designed for deep-sea oil rigs and tank treads. It was perfect. I donned my heavy-duty nitrile gloves, blue, tactical, and marched back to Sector 4. I applied the grease with the tenderness of a lover and the thoroughness of a crime scene cleaner. I slathered the mounting pole until it was no longer a piece of metal, but a glistening, obsidian monolith of rejection. It was thick, black, and smelled like a burning tire factory. "Try climbing that, Newton," I sneered, wiping a smudge of industrial sludge from my forehead. I took my position behind the patio glass. At 9:15, the general returned. He approached the pole, confident, arrogant. He leaped. He latched on. And then, glorious science took over. He slid. It was slow at first. A confused drift, and then he accelerated, his claws raking uselessly against the slime until he hit the grass with a wet thwomp. I let out a laugh that was less human joy and more supervillain triumph. I toasted him with my empty mug. "Gravity," I shouted through the glass. "It's the law." The general stood up. He shook his paws, flinging droplets of black goo onto my manicured fescue. He looked at the pole. He looked at me. Then he looked at the flower bed, specifically the patch of fresh, red cedar mulch. He didn't run away. He ran to the mulch. He dove in. He rolled. He thrashed. He was breading himself. He was coating his grease-soaked body in sharp wooden chips, creating a sentient suit of 40-grit sandpaper. "No," I whispered, pressing my hand to the glass. That's tool usage." He returned to the pole. He looked like a swamp monster, a chaotic ball of tar and wood. He jumped. The mulch bit into the grease. The friction returned. He climbed slowly, deliberately, leaving a trail of destruction behind him. He reached the feeder. He ate. But he wasn't done. After gorging himself, the general descended. Instead of returning to the trees, he hopped onto the patio. My patio. My pristine Hampton white wicker furniture set, purchased 3 weeks ago for a sum that made my accountant weep. He walked across the love seat. Squish, pat, squish, pat. Every step left a perfect black grease and mulch paw print on the white cushions. He walked a circle, paused, and then dragged his tail across the centerpiece pillow, painting a thick, oily stripe of disrespect right down the middle. He looked at me one last time, his fur matted into a spiky, armored shell, and chattered. It sounded like a laugh. My knees gave out. I slid down the wall, watching the black stains soak into the fabric. The grease was winning. Physical barriers had failed. It was time for psychological operations and biological terror. I went to the dark web of gardening supplies, Amazon page 4, and purchased the nuclear option. Cry of the Banshee, ultrasonic pest repeller, and a 10-pound sack of apex predator wolf urine crystals. The box arrived at 1400 hours. The crystals looked like forbidden brown sugar and smelled like a wet dog wrapped in a gym sock that had been set on fire. It was the scent of pure, primal fear. I sprinkled it liberally around the base of the feeder, creating a circle of death. "Fear the wolf," I whispered, my eyes watering from the ammonia sting. "Respect the hierarchy." Next, I mounted the Banshee. It was a black box with a red LED that pulsed like a robotic heartbeat. I cranked the frequency dial to maximum agony. I couldn't hear a thing. Silence. Beautiful, expensive silence. I retreated to the living room, smugness radiating off me like heat lines on pavement. 10 minutes later, the barking started. My neighbor Ted owns a German shepherd named Baron von Barkels. Baron is a prize-winning show dog with the discipline of a Prussian soldier. But suddenly, Baron was screaming, not barking, screaming. He was throwing himself against the shared fence, foaming at the mouth, snapping at invisible demons. Rough day for the canine unit. I chuckled, sipping a kale smoothie. I didn't connect the dots. I assumed Baron had finally snapped under the pressure of suburban ennui. The barking continued for 6 straight hours. It was a rhythmic, concussive thud against the sanity of the neighborhood. Then came the dinner party. My wife, Carol, who treats my war against the general with a dismissive,
"It's just a squirrel, Arthur,"
had invited the Hendersons for alfresco tapas. We stepped onto the patio at 1900. The evening breeze shifted.
"Oh my God,
Brenda Henderson gagged, dropping a plate of bacon-wrapped dates.
what is that?"
The wolf urine crystals had activated. The humidity had turned the granules into a heavy, invisible miasma of musk. It didn't just smell, it had texture. It felt like walking into a urinal that hadn't been cleaned since the Reagan administration. "It's an earthy fertilizer," I lied, sweat beading on my upper lip. "It smells like a zoo threw up," Ted yelled over the fence, struggling to hold back a convulsing Baron.
"Inside!
Carol shrieked, her eyes watering.
Everyone inside now!"
We retreated into the kitchen, sealing the sliding doors, but it was too late. The scent had clung to my tactical cargo shorts. I was patient zero. We stood in the kitchen, the muffled sound of Baron frantically trying to dig a tunnel to China vibrating through the floorboards. The Hendersons stared at me. I smelled like the alpha male of a wolf pack that had terrible hygiene. "Who wants Chardonnay?" I asked. Nobody answered. I called in sick on Tuesday. I told my boss I had acute gastrointestinal volatility. It wasn't a lie. My stomach was churning, but it was from the acid reflux of unbridled vengeance, not a burrito. I spent the morning constructing the Hydra. It was a monstrosity of duct tape and malice. I had zip-tied my commercial-grade backpack leaf blower, the Tornado Force 9000, to a motion-activated floodlight sensor, which was also wired to a high-pressure impact sprinkler usually reserved for irrigating golf courses. The trigger zone was the front walkway. The kill zone was anything with a pulse. By 1100 hours, I was positioned in the living room. I was wearing a full-body ghillie suit I bought at an army surplus store. I looked like a sentient swamp monster blending perfectly into, well, standing conspicuously against my wife's beige live, laugh, love decor. I lay prone behind the sofa, watching the driveway through a gap in the curtains. "Come on, you fuzzy insurgent," I breathed, the burlap mask scratching my face. "Make a move." At 11:42, a vehicle breached the perimeter. It wasn't the general. It was a blue Amazon van. The driver, a young man with headphones and the dead-eyed optimism of the gig economy, hopped out. He was holding a package. I squinted. It was the shock collar for small game I had ordered with rush shipping. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in my chest. I had forgotten to set the system to manual. It was on auto sentry. "Abort!" I screamed, scrambling to my feet. My ghillie suit snagged on the coffee table. I went down hard, face planting into the carpet. Outside, the driver stepped onto the welcome mat. Click. The sound of the relay tripping was audible through the glass. The leaf blower roared to life instantly, a jet engine screaming at 200 miles per hour. The sprinkler engaged a microsecond later. It wasn't a spray, it was a water hammer. The driver was hit with a solid slug of water and a gale-force wind simultaneously. His hat vanished. His headphones were blown backward off his head. His cheeks rippled like a skydiver in free fall. He didn't scream. He couldn't. The air pressure forced his mouth open, turning him into a human wind tunnel. He dropped the package. The box hit the concrete and burst open. The shock collar skittered across the driveway. The driver spun 180 degrees, flailing his arms as if trying to swim through the air, and sprinted back to the van, slipping on the wet pavement, scrambling on all fours, and diving into the driver's seat. He peeled out, tires screeching, leaving a wet skid mark on the asphalt. I stood at the window, panting, looking like a bush that had broken into a house. The leaf blower finally wound down, coughing into silence. The general sat on top of the mailbox. He was perfectly dry. He watched the van drive away, then looked at me. He began to groom his tail. Sunday, the day of rest. Unless you are at war, in which case it is the day of aerial superiority. My in-laws were visiting. My mother-in-law, Beatrice, a woman who possesses the warmth of a glacier and the critical eye of a health inspector, was holding court on the patio. She was critiquing my mulch density.
"It looks patchy, Arthur,"
She sniffed, adjusting her floral moo-moo. I wasn't listening. I was piloting. Hidden behind the rhododendrons, I held the controller for the Vulture, a DJI Mavic Pro I had retrofitted with a robotic grabber claw usually found in arcade machines. I had ripped it out of a Toy Story game at the bowling alley. It was zip-tied to the drone's underbelly. "Target acquired," I whispered. The general was on the fence line, mocking me with a walnut. I engaged the rotors. Whirr. The Vulture lifted off, the claw dangling ominously like a skeletal hand. The plan was a surgical extraction. Swoop, grab, airlift the hostile to the county line. The general heard the mechanical hum. He didn't freeze. He panicked. For the first time, I saw fear, but fear makes soldiers unpredictable. Instead of running for the trees, he bolted toward the nearest high ground. "Beatrice." The general scrambled up the leg of her moo-moo, his claws finding purchase in the polyester blend.
"Ah, a rat! It's eating me!"
Beatrice shrieked, flailing like a wacky inflatable tube man. "Hold still, Beatrice! I have a lock!" I screamed, emerging from the bushes. I panicked. I toggled the switch to sport mode. The drone didn't swoop. It shrieked. It accelerated to 40 miles per hour in 2 seconds. I aimed for the squirrel clinging to her hip. Beatrice saw the flying robot coming at her face and did a surprising kung fu duck. I missed. The vulture sailed over her head, missing the general by millimeters, and continued its ballistic trajectory straight toward the house. "Pull up! Pull up!" I yelled at my thumbs. Too late. The drone smashed through the bay window with the sound of a bomb going off. It didn't stop there. It tangled in the crystal chandelier, a family heirloom, dragging the fixture down from the ceiling in a shower of sparks and plaster. The entire tangled mess, drone, glass, brass, and crystals, plummeted onto the dining room table. It landed directly in the center of the large ceramic bowl of Carol's famous potato salad. Kersplat! A mushroom cloud of mayonnaise and boiled eggs erupted, coating the walls, the curtains, and my father-in-law, who was just trying to eat a deviled egg in peace. Outside, silence fell. Beatrice was hyperventilating in the grass. The general hopped down from her hip. He looked at the shattered window. He looked at me. He took a bite of his walnut. The casualty report read like the budget of a failed nation-state. Double pane bay window replacement, $1,450. Antique brass chandelier, restoration, $3,200. Urgent care copay, Beatrice's panic attack, $75. Professional carpet cleaning, mayonnaise extraction, $400. Marriage counseling, retainer, pending. The house was quiet. Carol had taken her parents to a hotel, muttering something about unsafe working conditions and needing space to evaluate her life choices. I was alone. I sat on the back steps of the patio. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the battlefield. The yard was a ruin. There were burn marks from the wolf urine chemical reaction. There were grease stains on the pavers. There was a crater where the drone had initially tried to take off. It looked less like a garden and more like the set of a post-apocalyptic movie directed by a raccoon. I held the Fort Knox 3000 in my lap. It was bent. The polycarbonate tube was cracked. The unbreakable titanium perch was twisted into a shape that resembled a question mark. I sighed, a long, rattling exhale that emptied my lungs of pride. "You win," I whispered to the empty yard. I tossed the feeder onto the grass. It landed with a hollow plastic clatter. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the bag of premium nuts, the reserve stash. Cashews, almonds, macadamias, the good stuff. I didn't put them in a feeder. I didn't build a trap. I simply poured a pile of them onto the wooden step next to my knee. Then I cracked a beer. At 19 12-hours movement. The general emerged from the gloom. He didn't sprint. He didn't vibrate with chaotic energy. He walked slowly, favoring his left leg slightly. He looked tired. His fur was still matted with patches of dried axle grease and cedar mulch. He looked like a veteran returning from the front. He climbed the steps. He stopped 6 inches from my leg. He looked at the pile of nuts. Then he looked up at me. For the first time, there was no malice in his black eyes. There was only recognition. He knew the cost of this war. He knew the toll it took on a soul to hate this much. He sat back on his haunches. He picked up a cashew. He didn't stuff it in his cheeks. He held it with both paws, nibbling politely. I took a sip of beer. I picked up an almond and ate it. We sat there for 20 minutes as the fireflies came out, 2 broken warriors sharing a meal in the wreckage of our own making. "Nice climb on the moo-moo," I said softly. The general paused, twitched his nose, and kept eating. It wasn't peace, but it was a ceasefire. And for now, that was enough.